and welcome to this regular meeting of the Helotes City Council. It's February 26, 2015, and we are underway at 7 p.m. Before we get started, if you would, if you have an electronic communication device, aka cell phone, please turn it to off, silent, or vibrate so it won't disturb the meeting. And that being said, we will get right into the agenda. First up, we have the invocation. Tonight, Councilmember Blue will handle that part of the agenda, and then we will do the pledge to the American and Texas flags. So if you would please stand for the invocation and pledges.
Heavenly Father, as we gather here this evening, we are thankful for your presence as we contemplate issues that will shape the future of our community. We ask that you protect our police, firefighters, and all of our public servants as they work daily to make our community better for all of us. We thank you for the recent success of community events. We also ask for safe travel conditions this weekend as we anticipate the possibility of rain mixed with freezing weather. And finally, we ask that you provide guidance to our elected officials at all levels, that they keep the citizens first in every decision they make. This we ask in your holy name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible. Okay, next up on the agenda, we do have a public hearing scheduled, and we will open this public hearing at 7:02, and I will read through this just as a requirement of what we're supposed to do. This is to, public hearing is to give all interested persons the right to appear and be heard on the proposed annexation of the following parcels of real property. Last meeting, we started the calendar on each one of these annexations. There were 4 separate ones, but since the calendar is the same, this public hearing is going to include each of the 4 parcels that are anticipated for annexation. The first one is an approximate 20.076 acre parcel located at 10905 Paloma, San Antonio, Texas, 78254, more particularly described as CB 4450P-4C ABS 467. Next, we have an approximate 34.31 acre parcel generally located on Gulm Road, San Antonio, Texas, 78254, more particularly described as CB 4450 P-81A TR4 Survey 80 ABS 467, and CB 4450 P-81B TR1 Survey 80 ABS 467. The map shows this as 2 tracts, but the annexation is handling this as 1 tract. Next, we have an approximate 34.33 acre parcel located at 11821 Gulm Road, San Antonio, Texas, 78254, more particularly described as CB 4450 PT of P-4A Survey 80 ABS 467, and it's referred to as 04450-000-0041 and CB 4450 PT of P-4A ABS 467, referred to as 81600-467-0040, and referred to 04450-000-0043. And the last tract, again shown on the map as 2 separate tracts but being annexed as 1, is an approximate 33.57 acre parcel generally located on Gulm Road, San Antonio, Texas 78254, more particularly described as CB 4450, P-81 TR3, Survey 80, ABS 467, and CB 4450, P-81C TR2, Survey 80, ABS 467. Hopefully y'all got all of that. And I will ask Grace, anyone sign up to speak at this public hearing? Okay. And I opened it at 7:02, correct? And we're gonna close it at 7:06. Okay, that takes us to our open session, citizens to be heard, and I'm anticipating no one signed up, okay? So we will go to the consent agenda. And consent agenda is just a grouping of items intended for the council to pass with one motion and one second. So I'll ask, are there any questions or any requests to pull either one of these items? This is consent agenda items 4 and 5 tonight, so with no questions or comments, I would ask for a motion and a second to approve consent items 4 and 5.
Mr. Mayor, I move that we accept agenda items 4 and 5 as written.
The motion would be to approve, correct?
Approve. Yeah.
Approve. So we have a motion from Massey. Do we have a second?
I'll second that.
Second from Blue. We have a motion from Massey, a second from Blue to approve consent agenda items 4 and 5. No further discussion being required. We will call the question. All in favor of approving consent agendas items 4 and 5, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. Motion carries, and those two items, 4 and 5, are hereby approved. That takes us to, in my opinion, the most exciting agenda item on the agenda tonight, and that's our audit report on last year's fiscal year. And tonight, Kim from Armstrong, Vaughn and Associates is our auditors, is going to make the presentation. Make sure the mic is on, okay? And just tell us who you are and take it away.
Will do. Good evening, Mayor, Council, and staff. My name is Kim Roach. I'm with Armstrong, Vaughn and Associates, and I'm here to present the audit report for your fiscal year ended September 30th, 2014. I believe you've got a copy of the audit there in front of you. I'm going to hit on some of the major highlights of the report and would be happy to entertain any questions that you may have. If you turn to page 1, actually pages 1 and 2 begin our audit opinion. We gave what's called an unmodified opinion on the financial statements. That essentially means that your financial statements were materially correct as prepared by management. We did have some typical audit adjustments that we made as part of our procedures, and those have all been discussed with management and all approved. One of the things we'll touch on a little bit later is, of course, in our letter to you that we're required to communicate would be if there were any significant adjustments. And we had just a couple, but they were kind of unusual items that we felt like were done, and again, they were discussed thoroughly with management and they agreed to those adjusting entries. So next, if you'll turn over to pages 15 and 16. This represents your balance sheet for all your governmental funds. Now, currently, as of September 30, 2014, this did not include your dispatch and EMS funds, as they were still considered business-type activities, and we'll look at those separately here in just a second. But so your governmental funds, in this case, as I mentioned, this would include everything except those other two. So you see a separate column for your general fund, the economic development fund, the debt service fund, and then lastly, any non-major funds that you have would be totaled here, but in your case, you only have the one, so you see the capital projects fund there. So going down each of those columns, you'll notice under your general fund, you had total assets of just over $4.1 million. Of that, most of it was actually due from other funds, and in this case, it was primarily due from the dispatch and EMS fund. The rest of your assets were primarily made up of cash and investments, and then you also had some receivables there that you can see listed out. You also had liabilities in your general fund of $317,000, and that left you, after some deferred inflows of resources, which essentially represented any uncollected property taxes at year end, of a total fund balance of $3.8 million. Now, of that total fund balance, you can see some restrictions there for certain items that, such as your court security and technology, the police department, your PEG funds that you received from Time Warner. And you can see there that you had an unassigned fund balance, meaning it can be used on any purpose of the city for $3.7 million. In your economic development fund, you'll notice that you had total assets of almost $695,000. Here, the bulk of which, of course, is your cash and investments. The remaining was pretty much just your sales tax that was collected within the 2 months following year end, and then some funds that were due from other funds. You'll notice you have very few liabilities, just $10,000, and so therefore most of your fund balance is obviously committed for the Economic Development Fund for $684,000. Any questions on any of that? The last one I wanted to touch on just briefly was, of course, your debt service fund. Again, you can see here that that's mostly made up of your cash and investments within your total assets. You did have some unearned revenue, or excuse me, you had some of the deferred inflows of resources. Again, those represent your uncollected property taxes. And you'll notice that you actually had a fund balance of $4,000. And the only reason why I wanted to bring this to your attention is you may recall that management actually chose to use some of those funds for other items rather than having to finance some additional items. There were some, those previously collected funds were used on new items rather than financing. So that's what kind of lowered that fund balance down to really just be more of a current operating figure. Any questions on any of that? If you'll turn to pages 18 and 19 then. Again, going down those same columns, you'll notice in the general fund you had total revenues of $5.1 million, total expenditures of $4.5 million, and after transfers and the proceeds from the note payable to purchase the land that you acquired in the previous year, you'll see that you had a positive change in fund balance of $844,000. In your economic development fund, you had $539,000 worth of revenues, expenditures of $160,000. After transfers into the city, you'll see that you actually had a positive change in fund balance in the EDC of $121,000. And lastly, in your debt service, you had revenues of $585,000, expenditures of $940,000, and transfers in primarily from the EDC to cover their portion of the debt of $239,000, still left you a negative change in fund balance of $115,000. And like I mentioned before, that was mostly primarily to use up some of those previously collected funds rather than issuing some new debt and some new financing. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Kim, under revenues on page 18,
Yes, sir.
what is the miscellaneous?
That's actually a really good question. I should have looked into that a little closer. That typically can include just any other small items. If you had any sale of fixed assets or any kind of insurance reimbursements from TML, those would fall into that category. It does not come to my mind off.
Oh, okay.
Right.
What was that?
Surplus property if you sold any of your assets at auction or anything like that. Oh, yes, yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, if you'll turn over to pages, beginning on page 21. This is now your dispatch and EMS fund. As I mentioned before, these as of September 2014 were still shown separately as business type activities, which means that they should be generating enough revenues to cover their cost. You'll see here in a minute that they obviously do not, as I'm sure you're already aware of, and that's why there's been a change here in your fiscal year 15 to incorporate these within the general fund. Your dispatch fund, of course, had total assets there of $350,000. That included the net value of your assets that were in that fund, as far as like your fixed assets, any equipment, vehicles. Total liabilities of $1.2 million. You can see there the bulk of that is due to the general fund because it had been funding some additional cost in that fund. And that left you a net position of $853,000 deficit. In the EMS, it's a similar picture. You can see your total assets are 183,000. Total liabilities were 1.1 million, and that left you that deficit of 987,000. Again, this is the reasoning for incorporating that into the general fund going forward. On pages 22, it just details out the.
Kim, before you go
Oh,
on,
yes, sir.
can you address how that's a cumulative?
Oh, yes. This would have been from the inception of these funds being recorded as business type. So this would be as of September 30, but it would be from the inception of these funds being pulled separately. Also here in just a minute, I know that one of the things that we communicate to you in the letter is the number of months that your general operating, the number of months you have on hand of general operating expenditures. And I'm going to touch on that and see how it would have changed once these two funds have been incorporated into your general fund. So I'm sure that's probably the highlight. I probably should have started with that, but had to have something good to end on, right?
And also, since it's a cumulative, it needs to be addressed that does not mean that those funds are $1.8 million in the hole. Essentially, what we have done every year is budget revenues in excess of expenditures in the general fund to cover the deficit spending that we have in those proprietary funds. I think that's an important distinction.
That is very true.
And also just a reminder, the dispatch section of the city was started in October of 2010, and EMS was in March of 2011.
I also, just for food for thought, I don't see any city's EMS operate much differently than this, where unfortunately there's just, it's very difficult to see the revenues actually exceed or cover the costs that you would incur. So at some point it's just to recognize that it's a cost to your city to provide those services, and any revenues that you have to help offset that cost is just extra bonus, basically.
And as we've discussed before, that applies to all of our departments.
True, very true.
Because they all run as a deficit, and the revenues cover all of them. And
Yes, sir.
That's why we decided to move the EMS and the dispatch into the general budget, just to be equal to all of the other departments.
Yes, sir, very much. So any questions on those funds individually? Okay, well, if you'll turn over to pages 43 and 44. This is now looking at just your general fund, and it's just comparing your actual, which you'll see in the center of these pages, bolded, that's that center column, and it's compared to your final budget, so you can see just to the right of the bold column, your variance, whether a positive or negative, compared to the final budget. You can also see to the right of that a comparative column from 2013, just to give you a little bit better historical information. So looking at your total revenues, you can see that it was 5.1 million, which exceeded your expected final budget of 4.9. You had a positive variance of 219,000. That, of course, primarily came from your permits being much larger than what you'd anticipated. The only real major negative variance that you had, of course, was in municipal court, which is always a very difficult area to anticipate and to budget for. You can see the 2014 exceeded what you had in 2013 by quite a bit, actually, and that again was primarily coming from those permits. And then if you'll actually turn over to page 45, you'll see the total expenditures. Obviously, they've been detailed for you there and by department, but you'll notice on page 45 the total expenditures were 4.5 million, as we mentioned before. Your final budget was 4.4 million, so you did exceed your budget for the expenditures, but that primarily came from certain audit adjustments that were proposed, largely due to timing adjustments, as well as certain use of previous reserve funds were not shown as expenditures as they were being reduced. The original reserves were being reduced for those funds. We unfortunately have to show them here as expenditures, so that causes a little bit of a budget variance. So any questions there? Overall, you can see the net change in fund balance. As Rick pointed out, you did budget for a $700,000 positive change in your fund balance, and that was primarily to cover the anticipated deficits from the business type activities. Your actual change in fund balance, though, was a positive $844,000. So even though your expenditures exceeded budget a little bit, you still came out ahead from what you had anticipated. On page 46.
Before you go forward, I think it's important that we discuss a little further the expenditures, the $162,000 over expenditures, and explain a little bit more where that comes from. If you recall, council, we budgeted $50,000 for the land purchase, okay? The way that we budgeted that, however, was assuming that revenues are exceeding the cost for not only general services, but also all the services in the proprietary fund, and then we still had a $50,000 number that was in the black, essentially, that would cover that land purchase. The auditors are looking at that as it wasn't an official budgeted item, even though it was a part of the budget, which I disagree with, but nonetheless. And so they're putting the $50,000 in as an unbudgeted expenditure, even though that was a part of the budget process. The other part that's important here, and one of the other significant reasons for the $162,000, if you recall, in prior fiscal years, we did not budget for municipal court security, municipal court technology, PEG fund, all of those. We actually created this budget year separate funds for each one of those accounts. And so because we were operating under a prior resolution that council had adopted that said that we couldn't go over a $9,000 expenditure out of those accounts every year, okay? But we never had an established budgeted fund for those accounts. So because it wasn't a budgeted fund, we were still legally spending out of those accounts. And we should have spent them because they're restricted funds and you want to spend that money first because then you have to use it for that purpose. But because of that, they then counted as an unbudgeted expenditure, and that's the other reason for the $162,000. The final thing was there were some audit adjustments that, frankly, we won't know until they get here and start doing their audit. But the vast majority, I think, is going to be that $50,000 plus the restricted funds that prior were not formally budgeted. Going forward, they will be budgeted or are budgeted, and so that this situation shouldn't be reflected in this manner in the future.
On page 46, you'll notice your budget to actual for the EDC. As we mentioned before, the total revenues were $539,000. That was a little bit under what your final budget was, so you actually had a negative variance there of $43,000. However, your total expenditures had a positive variance of $28,000 as they were below your final budget. And therefore, even after the transfers, which were anticipated to be a little bit higher to the city or to the general fund, you can see that the EDC had initially budgeted to have a negative change in fund balance of $64,000, but actually ended up with a positive change in fund balance of $121,000. Any questions on any of the figures that we've covered so far?
Yeah, I got a quick
Yes, sir.
question. Back on page 45, under the notes payable.
Yes, sir.
Other financing sources, note payable proceeds, the $200,000, is that the remaining balance on that note for the property?
That was essentially the city was given cash, if you will, through the financing to go purchase the land. So that was actually the total financing that was received.
Okay, so the $50,000 that we've talked about here in the debt service, was that part of that? Was that the initial payment? The
Yes,
down
sir, that was the
payment
initial payment. So you have a remaining balance as of September 30 of $150,000.
Okay, that's what I thought, but I was looking at the note payable of $200,000, so I was wondering why
Sure,
change.
sure. Yeah, the $200,000 was just the initial proceeds, and then minus that initial, or that first down payment of $50,000 left you with $150,000 going forward.
And in October of this last year, we made the second payment, so our balance now is 100.
Is 100.
And again, that note is zero interest over a 4-year period.
Yes, sir. Well, the last part of the actual report here that I wanted to touch on is on page 48.
What page? 48?
Page 48.
Okay.
As you may recall, I briefly brought up to you last year that there are some new standards coming that will be in effect for the city's report next year, where you have to recognize the amount of your pension retirement that's been currently paid into TMRS, as well as what the estimated actual liability would be due. So based on your 2013 information that's been provided by TMRS, you can see there in the very bottom row that your amount you've paid in was $3.5 million. Their estimated amount that you would actually owe at this point is 3.9, and that leaves you an unfunded liability of $448,000. Now, this would not necessarily affect your day-to-day or your regular budgeting process. The only thing I can see it doing is that TMRS may change how much your annual required contributions would be to try to fund some of that unfunded amount. But essentially what this effect will become is that on our full accrual statements, that is not the ones that you budget based on, you'll see this additional liability. I looked, and it's not going to throw you in any kind of deficit or any kind of negative impact or anything. Your unfunded liability is actually quite low, comparatively speaking. So, well, if there's no other questions there, let me just touch on a couple of things on the letter that would be loose in your reports, I hope. Should be towards the back. Pretty much everything in here was pretty standard from year to year, so I'm actually only going to touch on the part that I hope would be of benefit to you, and that's on the very last page, the trend analysis. This will show you from the last 5 years kind of the trend as what's been going on. You can see just in the general fund, as I mentioned, there were some of those restrictions in the general fund, so this is looking at just the unassigned, what was not restricted. And you can see as of September 30, you did have 3.7 million, as I mentioned before. Your average monthly operating expenditures, now that would not include any kind of debt service or any kind of capital outlay that you might incur from year to year, but just your average operating expenditures are $360,000. And so that left you with about 10.5 months in your fund balance. Now, as I mentioned before, one of the things that Rick asked me to bring to your attention tonight was that 10.5 months is a little bit inflated because of the fact of the way that at this point, the EMS and dispatch had been shown separately. But if you wanted to combine the two and have a little bit of an idea of what next year's effect will look like, I kind of redid the calculation as of September 2014. Had they already been combined, that 10.5 months would have dropped down to about 3.7. So definitely the reason why the general fund's been as big as it has been is because it has been basically covering the additional services and costs incurred for those two funds. Any questions about that? Or?
And I would like to address that. I asked him to bring that up tonight because, as you know, every time we go through this audit, the question always comes up, well, how much is too much? And every time we've had an audit, the month of the average monthly operating expenditure, the months of average monthly expenditures and fund balance has gone up. And I kept waving the white flag or the red flag and saying, this doesn't make sense. So I asked her to actually calculate, since we have now incorporated the dispatch or the proprietary funds into the general fund this year, because we're still operating within that 3 to 6 month threshold, which is where we should be operating according to GASB, but it certainly is not as good as everybody has always said that it was, which is important when we go forward talking about capital projects, which will happen next month.
So, may I ask a question? Sure. So this 10.5 months as of 9/30/14, next year in the same time, when you're presenting this, it's going to be 3.5.
Roughly. And probably what we'll do is, especially in this particular report, because this is just to try to give you some information, we may even try to go back into those previous years and so that it's not just one big drop all of a sudden the year that change was made, but just try to give you a picture, had they been combined all along, what would that effect kind of look like?
And I want to make it clear, does everybody understand, and if you don't, please let us explain it better, why we're going from 10.5 to 3.7? Because we're now incorporating all of the liabilities from the proprietary funds into the general fund. Okay, essentially.
Which they always were kind of before,
They
but
were.
they were two separate pictures, and now they'll be one.
They were, but it is much more understandable now since they're all combined into one, where the city's actually operating.
And what is the difference between a proprietary fund and the general fund? Why, I don't understand that.
The proprietary fund is the dispatch and EMS fund. Well, was the dispatch and EMS. When those two were created, the thought process was that we hopefully could, particularly on dispatch, generate enough revenue to offset expenditures. And most of the expenditures for both of those divisions are going to be personnel. Now, I will say in that number, we're going to disagree on this, but I think it's a little inflated because they include assets and all of that sort of stuff that we've already bought through 2007 C of O money, but nonetheless, it is what it is. And I have to go along with it even though I don't like it. So that includes the majority of the personnel from EMS and dispatch every year.
And since it didn't happen, that it was self-sustaining, you decided to move it over to the general fund and show it as a liability.
And show it as a liability and show it as going forward as a realistic expense out of the general fund.
Okay.
It was always in the audit as an expense or as a liability. And if you looked at the prior audits, it always said due to general fund, which was a negative because the general fund was covering the cost of those two departments. And so this offers a much clearer picture, in our opinion, how dispatch and EMS and all the departments really are now affecting the revenues coming into the city.
Well, and I think it's important to note that when we started these two departments, and the reason we went with the proprietary approach was so that we could look at each one of them as separate business entities, anticipating revenue in both, knowing full well that we probably would never cover our costs, but hopefully we would offset some of it. A couple of things happened that we didn't anticipate. One was that Bear County Dispatch tossed out an offer that many cities couldn't pass up, and that was to provide dispatch service for them at no charge. And so we had several cities that were contemplating going with us and had actually pretty well given us a verbal commitment to allow us to dispatch for their cities for a fee. However, when that proposal was made, the comments that we had was it's hard to pass up free. The general consensus among those cities was that they were not entirely satisfied with the service, but you can't argue with the price. And so that's where we are. The only thing that we're anticipating is that for the last 2 to 3 years, Bear County has given notice that they were going to go ahead and start charging a fee. However, at the last minute, the decision was made to not do that. So we're hoping that within the next 2 to 3 years, they will begin charging, and that maybe some of those cities then will come over and let us dispatch for them. We did not recommend moving these two proprietary accounts into the general budget because they were running at a deficit, because as we explained, all of our departments run at a deficit. We felt like it was for two reasons. Number one, the proprietary approach in the separate accounts was confusing to a lot of people, including us. And it wasn't fair to those two departments to have red lights flashing because all of our departments are running at a deficit. That's why we have the general revenues that we have is to pay to run the services of the city. We also found in looking at other cities, and I believe we looked at 10 other cities that have dispatch centers and EMS, none of those cities separated them out like we do. And so for that reason, we felt like it was important that they be treated like all other city departments. To be fair not only to them, but to make it seem logical like it is in other cities. I will say that we seem to document our revenue and expenses of those two departments better than any other city we saw, because most of them really had no clue what it was costing them to provide those two services. So that's really where we are on that. And I feel going forward, even though it's going to maybe look a little different as far as our operating capital in the number of months was going to drop from 10 to say 3 or 4, it's really going to make much more sense in the long run, and I think we'll see things improve as the years go by.
Yes, sir, I agree.
That's my thought on it anyway. But hopefully that explains a little bit of the logic, and understand that we're trying to just be in the way we operate like other cities, and understand that all of our departments run as a deficit. That's the most important thing.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thanks.
Well, in conclusion, I just would like to say that it's always a wonderful opportunity to work with your city. Management and staff, and as well as yourselves, are just wonderful. They make our lives as easy as it could possibly be, and I just never want to miss out on an opportunity to say so. So we thoroughly enjoy the chance to work with you.
Great, I always like to have a little clarification and have you reinforce a couple of things. Number one, that the fact that we had no deficiencies or discrepancies or negative comments, this is considered, once again, a clean audit.
Yes,
correct?
sir, very much.
And compared to other cities similar to Helotes in size, population-wise and revenue and all that, we're operating probably better than most.
Yes, sir. I can agree to that. I will also just add to that this year in particular, there must have been some sort of black cloud following me, and this was the first city that I showed up that all the records were ready for me to start auditing, and it made my life much easier, and I was very appreciative of that, and so it just made the audit process go very smooth.
Great.
And unfortunately, we couldn't come up with any recommendations for improvement this year, and I feel like I'm doing y'all a disservice to not be able to come up with something, so I apologize for that.
That's okay. Any other questions for Kim?
Yeah,
Bert has one.
I guess I don't need to ask the question if there's a limit on the amount we can have in reserve then, but is there a limit?
To my knowledge, there's no limit.
There
There's a recommended average, but I don't know that there's a
3 to 6.
requirement that, or something that says you can't go over.
I have heard of some cities that have upwards of 12 months or more in reserves. At least that's what I've been told. And as I think all of the council has discussed before, in my opinion, there is a point where you have to say, hey, we need to do something because we don't want to appear greedy, I guess would be the best way to put it. So as long as we're within that 3 to 6 months that's recommended, that should be very comfortable. If we go over that a little bit, it's not gonna hurt anything, but it looks like from now on, we're gonna stay well within that 3 to 6 month. Would you agree with that?
I think so, just on my preliminary look. I also think it's important to realize that sometimes cities may go over that 3 to 6 month recommended because they do realize that something's coming down the road very quickly. I know obviously that y'all have got some major capital projects coming up possibly in the future. So even if you had exceeded and still been at that 10.5 months, ignoring, that it wasn't a complete picture before, I think a lot of times just knowing that there are other projects that are coming up in the future is
Well,
another explanation.
And it is a big benefit to us in some respects. Like last year when we purchased the cameras for the police patrol units, instead of financing, we were able to use general fund money, and it wound up saving us, I believe it was close to $20,000 over a period of 3 or 4 years if we had financed it. So it is nice to have maybe a little extra or at least enough to be able to do those kinds of things to actually save the city money over a short period of time.
Very much, I would think.
Okay.
I had-
Anything
I-
else?
Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
One step, okay. Kim, maybe you can remember, I know in a perfect world, our property taxes and sales taxes are supposed to kind of be the same. Isn't that the way they are? Have we gotten further away from that? Or do you remember? I can't remember from,
Well, I know that they're increasing, or well, let me rephrase that. Your revenues collected are increasing.
but the percentages now are sales tax 26% and property taxes are 42%. I thought they were closer than that last year.
Oh, I see. Just be comparing the two to
right.
each other.
The state recommends in their revenue reports that it should be about 30-30 for a total of 60. And then the other 40% of revenue generally will come from your permitting, franchise fees, municipal courts, those kinds of things.
Gotcha.
And so our objective has always been to try and balance that. It is better than it was, say, 5 years ago, because the property tax was up in the mid-50s, and the sales tax was below 20. So we are getting better, but until we get more businesses producing more sales tax, that's going to stay about the same. We hope that we get some new businesses in here within the next couple of years, and that to me is the only way we're going to help that, because it wouldn't make sense to me to lower the property tax much more than we have it right now without an appreciable increase in sales taxes.
Certainly.
And really, when you look at the state of Texas and the revenues to cities, the state, we're the 49th state out of 50 as far as revenue provided from the state to cities. That's why the state gives us such a wide latitude to set property taxes and have sales taxes and be able to do all of the other things that we can do in the way of franchise fees and permit fees and the other sources of revenue that we have, because that's how cities can provide the services that they provide. And so it's always important to know that it's up to us to keep those things in balance, because we're getting no help from the state.
Right. Just, it's not broken down by percentage, but if you turn to page 67 in the report, this will give you a historical look for the last 10 years, just for those couple of items in revenue, but it does include the property tax and the sales tax.
Yeah, I remember that chart.
Okay.
Great.
Well, great. Well,
Thank
thank
you.
y'all very much.
Anything else?
No, sir.
Alex?
Do we have to accept something or not? It's not on the agenda, I just didn't know if we had to.
Just discuss and take action.
Yes, you do.
Yeah, we do. Good catch there. I had not highlighted that. Okay, that it? You're good. We'll
Just
take care
go
of that.
ahead.
Don't worry about it. Okay, that being the report and no further questions, this is an action item. And so we would entertain now a motion and a second to accept the audit for last year as it has been presented to us tonight.
Mr. Mayor?
Go ahead.
Mr. Mayor, I move that we receive and accept the audit as it has been presented.
Okay, we have a motion from Blue, a second,
Second.
a second from Villanueva. So having a motion and a second, we will have any other discussion? Anybody have any comments? Okay, no further comments. We will go to the question. All in favor of accepting and approving the audit as presented tonight, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. Motion carries. The budget is accepted. Kim, great job. Thanks. You're welcome to stay. You got a kid. She's got a young one at home, so thanks again, Kim. Okay, next up, we have a discussion and action item for a request for a variance to detention or fee in lieu of requirements by the Helotes Festival Association. And before we get into accepting a motion in a second, I would like to just point out that we received an affidavit from Council Member Buys. He has chosen to abstain from a vote on this item because he is a member of the Board of Directors of the Helotes Festival Association. However, he will remain on the dais because he's representing the Helotes Festival Association and will be able to answer any questions that the council has. That being said, we would ask for a motion and a second to discuss and take action on this variance request.
Mr. Mayor, I make a motion that we discuss and take action on item number 7 as written.
We have a motion from Fredericks. Do we have a second? Second from Villanueva to open discussion and possible action on a request for a variance for a fee in lieu of primarily. And staff presented in a request form where we gave a little bit of information. Did you all receive that? Okay, so basically, just as a short explanation, the way we saw this as internal from the staff's perspective in mind is that the variance would first be for the consideration of not using the entire 15 acres that's explained in the agenda request in calculating the fee in lieu of, because that is an exorbitant amount, and I believe it's safe to say that anyone that came in here, we would probably find some way to lower that cost on most projects, not all, and there's of course no certainty to that. Staff did come up with an alternate suggestion, and that's to use the Old Town Special Districts calculations for fee in lieu of, where the actual square footage of the proposed impervious cover would be considered, and staff put together the example on the second page, or the back of that form, where we would figure a total of 6,204 square feet, basically at 8 cents per square foot, for a total of $496. So in looking at it, I believe the consideration for council that I would recommend is, first of all, give a variance to consider not counting 15 acres, and then the decision would be whether or not to consider anything, the special district for $496 calculation, or just eliminate all costs. So I think that's the discussion that you guys would have on this. Of course, any other thing that you're thinking about is important, so that's just a suggestion from staff and me. So, Paul, it was your motion, you're first up on this, and like I say, Bert's here to answer any questions.
No, I would just say that I am in favor of the variance, and I agree with, obviously, our engineer was in favor of it. There's not a lot of impervious cover out there, and they're putting in 3 small, fairly small structures, so I don't believe that would be a problem. The Festival Association is a good partner for the city. They do allow us to use their facilities a couple times a year. So I would be for the waiving of the fee if it was up to me.
Ed?
I'm
You're-
in favor of the variance as well. The calculation makes total sense. You're applying a rule from the Old Town District onto this one. I think it would be rather unreasonable to charge that 49,000 on 15 acres. So I'm okay with it.
Yeah, Alex?
I concur exactly, I think. Now, I know Paul had mentioned the waiving of the fee even at the calculation on the back page, and I concur with that as well. I don't see how that requirement is substantial, given the fact that normally the water runoff is what we'd be worried about, where these are gonna be located, and the vast amount of open property they have. I can't see how any impervious cover that these bathrooms are gonna contribute to will have any effect to the water runoff the property.
Okay. Cindy?
Oh, I'm in total agreement. Festival Association has been around for a real long time, and they've done a lot for the city, and I am for the variance, and also I would suggest that we don't charge them a fee.
Anything else? Any follow-up? Bert thanks you very much for not having any questions that he has to answer.
Yeah, you said, whenever you said, I'm gonna answer any question they have, I'm going, wait a minute.
I do have a quick question. Are these gonna be tied in? Do you have a septic?
No, we already have our permit from SAWS. We're hooking in,
They'll be running a sewer line, and it is on the plan, so if
Yeah,
you're
we will-
thumbing through the plans.
we will be hooking up to SAWS. We will not be hooking up to SAWS water, though. We will be using our well, because that is really expensive.
Anything else? Okay, just for clarification, the motion is, if I'm correct on this, to accept the staff's recommendation as far as fee calculations, however, waive all fees for fee in lieu of, and approve the construction as far as fee in lieu of goes, approve the project with no fee at all.
Correct.
Okay, so that's the motion as it stands. We have a second to that motion. Is that the way you understand it? Okay, no further discussion. We will call the question. All in favor of approving the variance to void any charge for fee in lieu of, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. Motion carries, and the variance is hereby granted. Next up, we have a discussion of and action on a resolution clarifying the definition of municipality, and this will be going to the state legislature. And I did have a couple of corrections that I made to the original document, and hopefully you all have the corrected one. It was just a matter of adding a few words to, in my thinking, give it a little more clarity. And Rick took care of that, and you should have that revised copy. So that being said, if you've read this and agree with it, I would ask for a motion and a second to discuss and take action on this, and Rick and I are here to answer questions.
Mr. Mayor, I move that we discuss and take action on item number 8 as written.
We have a motion from Massey. Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
A second from Blue. So with a motion from Massey and a second from Blue on this resolution, on the definition of a municipality, Cindy, your motion, you're up first.
Yeah, my only question was, why would they exclude, general law cities?
That is, only to be answered by the guy who proposed the legislation.
No.
Rick, did you have any
Yes,
comments on it?
The issue here is that the Fourth Court of Appeals is specifically stating that the term municipality excludes everything but a home rule municipality.
Correct.
Okay, and that was the question of
That's
why.
that's
We
a
don't-
judge's opinion.
Oh, that's the judge's opinion.
It's
I
just-
haven't
I
taken,
see.
I haven't gone through the judge's opinion on that.
Okay.
But I know that that is within the case of Harry Bizios versus Town of Lakewood Village, that specifically is talking about building permits in ETJ.
Right.
So when you exclude a general law city from the term municipality, essentially what he is saying is that only home rule municipalities may essentially issue building permits in the ETJ. Well, obviously we're against that, it's been part of our code since 1992. So what this law firm who represents Town of Lakewood Village is trying to do is trying to muster support for making it clear within state law that municipality the definition includes general law, home rule, special law municipalities.
Okay, that's fine.
In other words, we're gonna fight with them to
Yeah, no, I agree.
oppose this.
I was just wondering why
ruling.
they would leave us out, but what they've left us out on a lot of things, so.
Yeah,
So, no, that's fine. I'm definitely for this. I'm very much for this.
okay. Alex, your second?
I'm all in favor, thank you.
Okay. Bert?
I've got a question. Was this when was this brought up, whenever we, the four of us went and met with Judge Wolf? Or how did you find out about this?
Through that law firm. right?
This came down through the law firm because they know that we're fighting a similar fight.
Oh, okay.
Well, this is much like we're hoping, if our litigations go forward, that we will get support from other cities
see.
to us. So this is just a way to help
Reciprocal.
support this case, and in the long run, like it says, help not only us, but all other general law and other types of cities in the state.
Okay.
Okay, Ed, any comments?
Kind of lose the definition, that's great.
Cindy, anything? Okay, so, no further discussion being requested, we will, go to the question on the approval of, the resolution as, laid out in item 8. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. Motion carries and the resolution, is approved. That takes us to item number 9, which is discussion and action on a resolution opposing any municipal revenue cap legislation. And, again, we'll accept the motion in a second for discussion and action.
Mr. Mayor, I move that we discuss and take action on item number 9 as written.
We have a motion from Massey. Do we have a second?
Second.
Yep, you beat you.
That's all right.
A second from Buys.
You can have it.
It's all yours.
No, you got it.
Okay.
So we have a motion from Massey, a second from Buys, and, as you may have, seen in the attached, memo and something that we, heard at, a meeting that we, had with, a bunch of, mayors, with, County Judge, Nelson Wolf. There is legislation, in Austin now, to lower the, rollback rate, potential from the 8% it is now to a maximum of 4%. And And so, of course, cities are gonna fight that because this could affect, the revenue that the cities get. So, this, resolution was written and we made some adjustments to it. But it has essentially the same message, so the same thing, we're just trying to watch out for not only the city of Helotes, but, help in the fight, for all other cities in the state. So, with that being said, Cindy, it's your motion. Do you have any questions or comments?
No, I believe that this is something that we need to do, definitely, because we can't have the state telling us, whether or not, actually taking away local control. This is local control, and we should be the ones to decide about this type of thing, whether we wanna raise the taxes or not. But if they put a cap on it, it's gonna really affect us negatively, and I'm very much for the resolution.
Anything else?
No.
Bert?
I agree with Mayor Pro Tem Massey that it is a misguided effort to reduce the property tax burden on homeowners and businesses. That's all I had.
Okay. Paul?
I agree, it's a message that we need to send, not to our
Alex? Ed? Okay. Discussion ending. We will call the question. All in favor of item 9 to approve the resolution opposing any municipal revenue caps legislation, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. Motion carries. The resolution is approved, and we will send it forward. By golly, that brings us to the end of our agenda. And thank you all for your participation. And I would ask at this time, before we adjourn, is there any opposition to adjourning? Any questions left unasked? See no objection to adjourning. We will hereby adjourn at 7:55.